Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's HFS research webinar. My name is Saurabh. I'm the president for HFS. I lead our global research and advisory capabilities. I've been told there are over 500 people who've registered for this webinar. So thanks for listening in and spending an hour. And I'm sure you'll find some of the conversations very worthwhile because today we are going to be talking about how to buy services as software. We've been talking about AI for the last 2 years, but I think how to buy and sell these things is still a mystery. It's still a black box. And to unravel all of that, I've got four of my colleagues, our senior advisors at HFS, who've been working with clients in and out, day in and day out, talking about these things, and would love to get them to introduce themselves very quickly before we hop on. So maybe I'll start with you, Mike.
Hi, well, Mike Hobday. I've been with HFS now almost 6 months. Yeah, no, I guess it is 6 months. Before I was with HFS as senior advisor. I was running a document processing AI company, which was sold in August for the last, I guess, 5 months. And before that, I was the general manager at IBM, responsible for intelligent automation across Europe, which is where I first came across HFS. I guess kind of 12 years ago now, in the early days of RPA.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mike. Ian?
Good morning, everybody. Ian Maher, based in Boston. I've worked with Saurabh and Phil and HFS probably for the best part of the last 6 years on projects with enterprises, and been very lucky to see the development of sort of the contractual and sort of accommodation of emerging technologies. My background is on both sides, both on the sales side for organizations, Fujitsu and Gartner itself, but then on the actual real life experience on the operational side, largely in insurance, P&C, life and annuities in the States. So very glad to share all the errors that we've made and maybe give folks on the call some suggestions today.
Thanks, Ian. Joe?
Good morning, afternoon, everyone. Joe Montrosse. I've spent the last 30 years focused on all things operations for Fortune 500 organizations for the most part, and a significant portion over the last several months with HFS, actually a few years. Well, several months with HFS, but a few years on how to AI, so to speak, how to actually implement some of the promises that folks are making and how to prioritize what the most significant impacts should be from leveraging services as software. Thanks, Saurabh.
Thanks, Joe. And last but not the least, Justin, who joins us from a fishing trip somewhere in Canada.
Good morning, everybody. Justin Southwell. I've been with HFS almost 6 months. My background is more on the enterprise side. I spent over 20 years running procurement and GBS operations in life sciences and warehousing organizations. So excited to be here today and talk through what are we buying next, because there's been lots of changes in the industry and there's lots of things that I think people can learn from some of the mistakes I've made and all the other smart people on this call today. So looking forward to the discussion, Saurabh.
All right, thank you, everyone. Just before we get started, all participants are muted, but please, we want to make this interactive. There is a Q&A bar, so feel free to add your questions, and I'll answer the easy ones and I'll pose all the difficult ones to my four colleagues here. We want to spend about 45 minutes talking through what we are seeing in the market, how we are advising clients, but we also want to dedicate about 10 to 15 minutes at the end to get your questions in. And by the way, all these slides will be available to you. All the registrants will get this slide. The recording will be available as well on our website once our marketing colleagues are able to make it ready. So I think all of you know HFS. I guess that's why you are on the call, but HFS has been shaping the market narrative for close to 15 years now. I think, Mike, you talked about RPA when that's how we got to know each other, but we were the ones who coined the term RPA. Since then, we've coined several terms, but the one that really stuck a nerve was this concept of services as software that we coined in 2024, which really talks about the convergence of services and software. Right now, services are becoming more and more productized, and every software companies is starting to behave like services. And that's been the biggest business model change as a result of AI. So we coined that term. And then we also launched what we call the AI First Deal Labs, which I'm pretty sure we'll talk about as we go along, because I think the whole process of buying and selling services has not changed since the 1990s. We've added bells and whistles to our outsourcing and technology contracts, but fundamentally they've not changed. And I think it almost feels like we're trying to subscribe to Netflix, but we're counting DVDs. It's just not going to work. And we're gonna talk about, at least from an HFS perspective, our point of view on how we change that process and how we change some of the IP associated with that process today. In terms of the agenda, I'll probably take 5-10 minutes to just set the context of why the old playbook of buying services doesn't work anymore. I think then we'll get into a panel discussion with my colleagues here on really the things that need to change, from the business case to the RFP-driven sourcing process to the pricing structures, what's happening with AI tokenomics, how should you think of service levels, the new terms and conditions that you need to add, and the old ones that you need to retire. And honestly, we also wanted to talk a little bit about AI sovereignty and how that's making its way into contracts, services contracts as well. And then, as I promised, we'll have a lot of time for your Q&A. So please start typing in your questions right now, and we'll try and make sure we answer as many as we can. So let's get going. Look, I think enterprises have really become frustrated with the current, both the services model and, to be honest, even with the software model. As you can see on this chart, about 3 in 4 enterprise clients that we talk to want to renegotiate their existing ITO BPO contracts, and almost 6 out of 10 want to actually renegotiate their software contracts as well, their SaaS contracts. And the reason is pretty simple. The model for services hasn't changed. It continues to be labor heavy. All of these things are priced on effort. And so what is the incentive for a service provider to drive innovation? There is none, unless they are just good people and they want to drive from their innate good nature. There is no contractual obligation to drive innovation, because we are pricing and buying services on effort. And same to a certain extent goes with software. Every software company comes to you and says, my workflow is the best workflow. Now you, Mr. or Miss Client, has to adapt to my workflow. Shouldn't it be the other way around? Shouldn't the software adapt to what you want to do? And by the way, if you want to change some of this, if you want to customize my software, then you go on the left-hand side and go and talk to the service providers who will charge you $2 million to customize it. And most likely it's going to be delayed and overpriced. And so this vicious cycle continues, right? We've got a feature bloat. I was talking to a CIO of a large CPG company, and he asked me, Saurabh, do you know how many applications we have? And he said, and I basically said, I don't know, but since you're asking me, it must be a large number. And he said, we have 2,000 applications, and those are the ones that I can count. Now, imagine anybody will say that they don't need 2,000, right? What the right number is, I don't know, but it's definitely not 2,000, right? So I think there is a software bloat, and there is as a result, the technical debt in our global 2,000 organizations continues to grow, and we're not addressing it. And this is why we see what's happening on the Wall Street. The Wall Street has practically given up on services. You look at the top 10 largest IT service providers at the bottom, and I started to look at their price to sales ratio. the average price to sales ratio of a services company is 1.5x right now. So for every dollar that they are generating, the market is giving them $1.50. That is actually almost trending towards commodity pricing, because the average S&P 500 PSR is 3.7. So the IT tech services is actually below the S&P 500 average. And you look at, on the other side, you look at what's happening with all the AI natives. You look at OpenAI, Anthropics of the world. Their price to sales ratio is just ballooning. It's like 45x, or in some cases, you start to look at SpaceX, it's close to 100. It might have come down over the last week or so, but still. And I think these two sides of this equation cannot match. I think the AI balloon will burst if we don't solve the fundamental problem that is associated with our services and software. And frankly, it's the same thing that's happening with the SaaS collapse, right? With software companies, their market caps has been declining like crazy over the last few months. So the Wall Street is actually giving up on the current services and software model as well. And we called it in 2024 when we coined the term services as software. I won't labor this forecast in detail, but essentially what we are seeing is almost a new category of services as software emerge, which is that orange triangle on the right-hand side, which is going to absorb revenue from both services, technology services, and software, and creates its own category, which we expect to become $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years or so. And on top of that, we'll start to see new solutions that we've not thought through right now. Now, we can't put a number to it yet, but that's the exciting part. That's the equity call. That's exciting in our business. All that we are focusing on is the bottom two layers, which are going through a deflationary moment right now, right? We don't expect the same labor-based services to continue to grow at 5 to 7%. You know, they are going to see deflation, because otherwise, what's the point? But the opportunity is this concept of services as software, where we see the lines between services and software blur. And I think there'll be winners and losers on both software and services side. But it's also very important to note that this is a generational opportunity, I feel, to unlock new value, which was far out of reach from our legacy models. And I think that's really, really exciting right now. Because imagine, I've highlighted 4 opportunities that we've not addressed so far. If you look at the global 2000 enterprises, we just did a huge study. Actually, Joe was leading it. We've got $18 trillion of enterprise debt across technology, data, process, and talent. Who's going to solve that? You know, is it going to be the AI native companies, or is it going to be our services contracts that should be addressing it? And that hasn't been solved for. You know, it's finally that we've got a nonlinear economic model with AI that's in front of us. And we'll talk about what that business case is. We call it the 4 Ps of performance, personalization, prediction, and productivity as the new business case or the new value proposition for these services, unlike the last 30 years, which has just been focused on cost. We can now open up new segments. You know, the mid-market and emerging geographies was almost locked out of the services play, because you know, the revenue from mid-market was almost always smaller than the cost of sales to sell to the mid-market. And I think all of that economics it's changing now. And finally, the tech services can move beyond the CIO's realm, right? We should be able to offer these services to CFOs, COOs, industry operations head, you know, sales heads, etc. And that unlocks, you know, so far, if you look at the tech services, they've only addressed 10 to 15% of the COGS, you know, because how big is your IT services spend? But now you can start to address a majority of the spend that was locked from the traditional services. So we are very, very excited at HFS about the potential But the problem is we don't know how to buy these services. And unless we do that, all of this potential is gonna go wasted. And that's what we are seeing right now is in the AI world, it's death by 1,000 POCs, where there is a point, a proof of concept in every nook and corner of every large enterprise, but hardly anybody is being able to scale it. And it's not a technology problem. It's yes, there is a lot of enterprise debts, but we also don't know how to buy these services. Can this, look at the RFP process itself. It takes 6 to 8 months to select a vendor, and the world changes in 6 to 8 months. So what are we doing? These multi-year rigid contracts, which are written around effort than outcomes, doesn't work anymore. The adversarial negotiations almost always stifles negotiation, and it's taking 6 to 8 months to select a vendor. And AI is also complicating the world. Tokenomics is a huge issue. Nobody can define what a token is. I've asked this question to so many people of tell me how many tokens I need to process an invoice, and nobody can answer that. So where are we going with this? And then everybody keeps talking about gain sharing. But gain sharing looks very sexy on day zero, but by day five, everybody's pointing fingers at each other. So I think those are the kind of things that we want to unearth a little bit in today's discussion. And I want to ask some of these hard questions to some of our senior advisors and see what are they advising to clients. And let me start with you, Joe. What is the business case? As you look at services as software, as you look at AI-led solutions, so far in the services world, we were primarily looking at cost savings and efficiency. Is that the business case? How should we look at the business case itself for services as software?
Sure. Thanks. Thanks, Saurabh. I think on the far left-hand side, that first productivity is table stakes. If you're not able to deliver productivity, then re-upping or executing a new agreement or moving into a new technology isn't going to get past board level approval for any significant initiative. But then as we're looking at why people are doing this in the first place and what the net benefit and priorities are, it has to reflect all of those items on the right. So the ability to be predictive, to get ahead of the curve, like Saurabh said, you can't take 8 months to figure out what you're going to do. You need to be able to do so rapidly and in 8 days have a really solid strategy for how you're going to work the next 8 months. From a personalization standpoint, the ability to deliver an experience to individuals at the individual level. So a sales leader versus a back office accountant to someone in operations and manufacturing on the plant floor. They all require significantly different things to get their job done, and you need to be able to do mass customization for that audience. And then from a performance standpoint, the ability not just to say that everything's green and all of the light switches are on, but to be able to demonstrate that with the data that's now available. But I'll take a pause. Let me know if that made sense.
It makes sense to me. Ian, you've been advising a lot of clients as well. Does this framework resonate?
Sort of, it resonates from the point of view as the potential benefits that an enterprise or a client may realize from a new relationship with a third party. But I'm going to go back to what is the most common situation when it comes to business cases. And when we get brought in to support both providers and enterprises, and we ask the question, where is the current business case? Not the one that we're intending to move towards. We often get the answer that we don't know. We're not sure where the it exists. And I think that's quite telling when we talk to enterprises about their efforts to really realize the benefit from the decisions that they've already made. So one of the things that really is over the last 6 to 9 months as AI and agentic AI has become, the hyper topic of the day is how well and how ready are enterprises to actually not just build the business case to the points that Joe's made, but actually to execute and see through the benefit realization of that business case. Because if that aspect is not there and if it's lacking in appropriate management and governance, then we again have just got more leakage of the potential benefits that we're all excited about. So I think there's substance in these 4 areas for sure. There's still traditional areas of cost improvement, economics, marginal gain. Then there's the really exciting area of activity to support the front office to grow not only customer bases but revenue and margin for the enterprise itself. But what's the reality of the day is how well is the enterprise, and this is a specific challenge to the sourcing and procurement leaders. How well are you in orchestrating what's needed for a business case to be built, executed, and then feed its way into a governance structure?
That's a very good point. And let me, Joe, ask you this question that Ian is raising. It goes back to the procurement and sourcing leaders, because right now, if you look at the sourcing process, we are still using the 1990s playbook, right? That we all first used of, let's do an RFI, then let's do an RFP, then let's do 6 months of negotiations, and let's do this dog and pony show, and all of that. And by that time, if it's run very well, it takes 6 to 8 months, and then we're all high-fiving each other. But in reality, I don't know if a solution that we think is really good will be a good solution in 8 months. So how, what are you advising clients on what's the sourcing process to use?
Sure. Well, it's certainly not sending an RFI, going through 4 to 6 weeks to figure out who you're going to invite to a bid, putting together an unnecessarily vague RFP that then attracts a bunch of PowerPoint presentations and meetings that are significantly longer than anyone would ever be comfortable with to determine who you think you like the best. And then maybe you get an LOI and an unnecessarily complex and entirely uncompelling negotiation to hopefully actually execute a contract. That's just not a process that anyone ever wanted, but there wasn't necessarily something that was significantly better out there. What we would recommend is getting, first of all, focusing on a simpler agreement that's really easy for everyone to execute, while it's also really easy to understand what's really in there and what are the priorities that you need to get out of this arrangement. So you can think of that as North Stars. You can think of it as just being clean and straightforward and getting it out of the way sooner than later so that you can focus on what's actually important. What are you going to do to address all of those 4 Ps? How's that going to align with the team between both the client and the supplier? And then how are you going to rapidly implement that solution? Because again, you don't have a year to actually make this stuff work these days. Things are moving much more quickly. So what you need to get out of this is the contract out of the way, the best terms between the 2 parties, and then a 100-day plan to actually get this thing done. Again, I'll take a pause, but that's really it. Focus on what's important, get the other stuff out of the way. No dogs, no ponies.
No dogs, no ponies. But I think we've done what Joe is recommending with several of our clients, and I think it's actually doable. So this is not just a PowerPoint, but we've worked together, this team and some of our other advisors. We've done a dozen of such deals by now. And this is actually possible to a large extent, give or take some things. So this is not just some pie in the sky analyst speak. I think this is the reality, and this is where the world is moving. You start with a North Star, give your providers a data challenge, and then bring people together in a workshop. This is not, we are not sending people to the Mars here. This is not rocket science. It should be solvable, and it shouldn't take 6 to 8 months. The other question, which is top of mind, and Ian, maybe you can start us off here, is pricing. Since I became an analyst as a young person in the 1990s, I've heard there is something called outcome-based pricing, and it's still, I hear there's something called outcome-based pricing. And everybody says, in fact, there's a question here which says every service provider says that they're moving to outcome-based pricing, but the reality is not there, right? Even if you look at our chart, and this is a survey, and I feel everybody wants to look good in a survey. Even there, it's like 20%. My sense is in reality, it's even less. Why do you think the current economic model for services is broken, Ian?
Saurabh, I think the pricing discussion sort of follows on from what Joe was saying about the business case. And just to add to Joe's input there, the best example I've seen in the last year of a procurement sourcing leader was when they actually had a business case permanently on record. And this is one of the few examples where I was really impressed by this leader in the enterprise who had a business case that was a dynamic document. It was always fresh. He in this case was actually engaged with his peers, with the revenue side of the house, with the operations side of the house, with the risk side of the house, with the finance side of the house. And he was maintaining the business case internally, the demands, at the same time as pulsing his current providers as well as the non-current providers. And he had this wonderful document which was ready to go, which really avoided the need for sort of a formal RF process. And I was very impressed. And I just thought when Joe was saying one of the things we wanted to do today was to say, well, what is good about the new way of acquiring services and acquiring sort of the more platform and automated base set of delivery models. And that was something that struck me as being really good. What comes from that business case, I think, are the drivers for pricing. Because the key thing about pricing is not to think that it's something that's given to you by the provider. I think today where we are is that pricing is something that's built jointly, and that's the pricing frameworks, the mechanism by which an enterprise is going to pay for some sort of committed or guaranteed result. The important thing from that phrase is the idea that this needs to be built together. And in some cases, that building of a pricing framework can't take place because the relationship is not there to support it. The transparency and understanding of how both the enterprise and the provider run their business, make money from their business and survive in their business really needs to be in place. The provider market is being disrupted, as you described, in terms of going from the old legacy to the new, in terms of margin is going to be of greater importance than revenue. So unless that trust to describe how both sides to this discussion about pricing can take place, it is going to be very difficult to land on the most appropriate pricing structure. The second thing I think that I'm seeing in the deals today is to be comfortable with employing more than one pricing framework. The deployment of AI and platform-based solutions into delivery models isn't equal across the enterprise. There will be areas of stability, areas of architectural stability in terms of chosen platforms and technologies, where the demand side is stable, that we can actually really think about output and outcome pricing because we have a chance of success. There are other areas where the enterprise doesn't understand itself, hasn't got the data integrity beyond small pockets of data, and it's likely to fail if we go too far towards an outcome-based model between the two. There is an inherent wish for this outcome-based pricing. But the reality is it really takes both sides to be completely transparent in the ability of both sides to contribute to it. My third sort of final thought about pricing is go with what you can be successful with. Try out areas of output and outcome pricing and use those examples across the enterprise as your learning curve of how you were successful, and then bring back those lessons into the larger playing field and start to continually migrate the older traditional pricing models to those that really can give benefit to both sides. That, again, that activity needs to be a dedicated focus as you go through this relationship maturity between the enterprise and the provider. So the key areas, don't think of just one as the only pricing model to take forward. Make sure that you're understanding the business drivers from the business case, because in some cases there will be a need for a quick win, and you may need to gain some productivity and improvement of expenses ahead of that being realized. But in other cases, an enterprise may be, I'll say, mature enough to recognize that a more continuous improvement, where there's not necessarily taking all of the dollars off the table up front, but an ability to sort of learn as we go, actually might present the best opportunity for improving marginal expense over a 5 to 10 year period, at the same time as getting success as we're changing the operating model that brings us the business outcomes we like. So sorry for a long sort of overview of pricing, but that's what we're seeing in the marketplace today.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ian. That was very eloquent. So don't get stuck into one pricing model and assume that's the best and you have to templatize everything to that. But be flexible, look at your business drivers, and then come to what's the right pricing model for you. But this pricing conversation is incomplete without discussing tokenomics, AI tokenomics. And Mike, I wanted to bring you into the conversation a little bit. And I'm seeing two issues. One, Mike, is these tokens are so obscure and it gets complicated so fast, right? There's a compute cost, then there's a token cost, then there's storage, the model tuning, there's human in the loop, and nobody can tell me how many tokens I need to do these transactions. So how do I budget for those? And on the other side, token maxing is a thing. We all have seen what happened to Uber. They finished all their tokens in like a quarter. So what, for the rest of the year, they are not an AI first company or what? So what are you recommending clients, Mike, on how to think through AI tokenomics?
Great. Well, thank you for talking to the slide for me. So, anyway, that will save a lot of time. So it's amazing, really, how tokenomics has become a major area of discussion. I was interested that you said earlier that you hadn't come across a common definition or understanding of what a token really was. If you went back 6 to 9 months ago, people were actually targeting and maximizing the use of tokens, and CFOs weren't actually budgeting at all. And then if you go back to, and I think that you speak to the Uber example, CFOs put a line item in and suddenly found that they were burning it away. And now we're sitting in a situation, by virtue of all the IPOs that are happening and going to happen, is those setting the prices for tokens going forward are looking to make a profit. And that's kind of backdrop to the change that we've seen over recent months, and it's moving fast. So what's been happening in the short term is COOs in particular, driven by their CFO, trying to find out where tokens are being consumed, which staff are actually using these AI models, and whether they're actually using it for business purposes at all, to see if they can align a number of things. One is to make sure that the right models are being used by the right staff in the right process, that don't overuse high-end models for low-end work. Obviously, deterring staff from using these applications for other purposes. And I think we're moving to, and you talked about the kind of line items, and it's very complex. that the CFOs have got to get their heads around. And I call it the cognitive cost of sales, that it will become a new measure, I think. And if you look at those line items that you described, you look at compute. Well, on the first off, you've got to come up with a forecast for, training and fine tuning. But CFOs have also got to ensure that as we become more and more reliant upon these models, particularly if we start to reduce staff to take the benefit of coming productivity, that you've actually got the compute power in the first place. And so actually buying up GPUs is something we're seeing in North America in particular, where large enterprises are wanting to secure their token pipeline. And then, as you rightly pointed out, the CFOs are then saying, well, do we have to use all of these larger models? Can't we use cheaper models? And clearly there's a trade-off between using these foundation models or frontier models, which can potentially generate 10x performance. And if your CFO is driving you to use lower end models, you're not going to get the business outcomes that you wanted. And then storage is an interesting one because obviously you've got your AI workloads, but the key thing in organizations is the maintenance of context. And context is something which actually costs you a significant number of tokens. So I'm not going to go through all the rest. The other items are very clear there, but the CFO's got to get their heads around, to your point, they've got to understand tokens and tokenomics. They've got to understand where these models are being used, in which process. And I think the earlier discussions around trying to articulate AI business cases in business terms, and rather than getting lost in some of the AI rhetoric, which is around, at the end of the day, productivity, outcomes, personalization, and keeping control of the costs around that will be key. But to your point, it's a complex environment, and the CFOs really got to get their heads around this, and that's an area which we're deep in at the moment. You've moved on. Go on.
Yeah, I was also going to ask you, so my takeaway from that is I shouldn't plan my vacation on Fable then.
No, exactly. Yeah.
But
true.
But the other question then becomes, how should you, what is your recommendation for the commercial model for services as software? Because these things are no longer just a service. They're sort of blurring of lines between services and software, right? And I actually stole this slide from you, Mike, where you were presenting this to one of our clients.
I recognized it.
Yeah, and so explain these 3-tier structure that you developed for.
So it's probably worth just saying this is where we've worked with a number of clients responding to very substantial RFPs and helping them think through potential pricing models. And where we landed, I think, through that active process with some of our very substantial clients in this space, was the idea of a kind of platform cost. This is the opportunity to play. And so that's a kind of foundational cost, which is essentially your agentic operating system. And then on top of that, you've got your variable costs, consumption-based costs. And then the third tier on top, which is the icing on the cake, I guess, is really linking it to business outcomes, which are meaningful to the business. And so you get this idea of, as a provider of services, my investment in the foundational platform is being recovered. We're giving CFOs a variable cost linked to business volumes, and we're giving upside in relation to the delivery of KPIs for the business. And we found that was very powerful and been adopted by a number of clients. I think the thing that perhaps isn't on the slide that needs to be thought about is when enterprises are buying contracts in this space, they're also thinking, and this plays into the earlier tokenomics idea, that that, and maybe it's historic, that tokens are getting cheaper, and therefore that needs to be baked into my contract, and therefore I'd expect these costs to be falling over time. And I think that's a debate, as the conversation on tokenomics has moved on, needs to be revisited. But more importantly, the framework for the contract needs to allow for innovation and development of solutions, and that's an area of flexibility that these contracts need.
Yeah, no, that is fantastic, Mike. And as you rightly mentioned, I think and Ian also, right? It's going to be linked to business drivers, but this was a helpful framework, I think, to think of services as software pricing. It's not just one. It was also the point that Ian made. It's not just one sort of structure, right? It's not just one input versus outcome. The answer is going to be a hybrid of some sorts.
And one of the benefits of the foundation layer was that end clients recognized that there was going to be a degree of investment in establishing the operating system and putting that in place, and you could build that into that bottom layer.
Yeah.
So
sorry, go on, Ian.
Sorry, Saurabh. Just one thing to build on the previous slide, and it's again real life experience where, and in this case, the sourcing leadership, we're in internal discussions with the FP&A colleagues across all of their business units that currently services were being consumed by, and they took a 6-month period, almost taking this exact chart and educating the FP&A function of how the world is likely to look in the future. And there was a concerted effort to educate. And I think that activity really helps in the enterprise coming together to realize the complexity of change that we're talking about with tokenomics and the whole idea of pricing and foundation layer and value layer and then differential layer. If that leader hadn't taken the time to educate internally, going to market and attempting to get a price from a provider would have been a complete waste of time, because internally the lack of knowledge of the challenge of the complexity just isn't there. So again, I'd really encourage our customers and people that are joining the call today, think about how you're educating internally together with the provider, so that when in fact you do go and step forward and change the contract structures and you change the engagement style, your colleagues internally are one step ahead of where they would have been if you hadn't taken the effort. That'll make you actually look higher and more valuable in their standing and result in a better contractual relationship for all involved.
Yeah, no, that's well said, Ian, as always. But Justin, I wanted to bring you into this conversation because a very related topic to what we've been discussing, the business case, the problem of measuring value that's being delivered. If you look at the 4 Ps, when I ever present that 4 Ps to a client, the first question they ask me is, how do I measure it? And which is honestly a good question. But our service levels in our contracts have always been about, uptime, accuracy, all of those. They're not really, maybe they're about productivity, but there's hardly any service levels around experience or performance, etc. What are you advising clients on how to think of performance metrics in these contracts?
Yeah, thanks, Saurabh. And you're right. The SLAs of the past were really built to measure human labor and system availability. And when you get into the agent world, an agent can be on all the time and confidently wrong very often. And so you need to kind of think differently about how you're measuring the business. And I think it goes back to some of the stuff that Ian and Mike were talking about, how it's not black and white, right? And you're going to need to have some growth through your SLAs and KPIs as you mature with your AI partners. And I talk to clients a lot. I'm sure everybody on this phone call has heard the term the watermelon SLA. You've got an order to cash process where your CFO is upset, but every SLA is green. Where I think agents can really add some value is kind of in those handoffs and in between the systems and that happen. And one of the things that we've talked to clients about in order to solve that is the concept of the process guardian, and somebody who really owns the value stream, not the individual vertical stacks. And you really need to think of things from an end-to-end perspective. But let's talk a little bit about the different accountability model that I think is resonating with clients recently. And so traditionally, when you sat with a provider down at the negotiation table in one of those dog and pony shows that hopefully you got to a contract with, everybody was trying to push risk and on the SLAs across the other side of the table. In reality, there's probably a few that could be owned individually by the provider. There's some that are probably co-owned, and there's some that the enterprise and the business should own as well. And that kind of helped develop this framework of the service level for SLAs, the experience level SLAs, and the value level SLAs. And SLA, the service level is more technical and more really within the service provider's individual realm. And those are the things that they have more control over: model accuracy, self-healing rate, deployment frequency. But there's also this middle ground, which is somewhat new in terms of the experience level, where both people have both the provider and the enterprise have some skin in the game. And that's really kind of, as you move towards those business outcomes, we recommend that you try and do this with, and Ian mentioned this earlier, some of those processes that are a bit more mature, where you've got really good data and you can measure this accurately. This sets a good foundation for how do you deploy this to other parts of your business. And then at the end of the day, the value level SLA really needs to be owned by the business, and they need to be able to measure that. And one of the things we're talking with clients now, and it kind of goes back to the concept of moving beyond just the CIO or the CPO. You've got to be in touch with your business partners, and when you think things are working, are they actually seeing those business benefits on the end, whether that's your supply chain partner or your commercial partners. It's really important that you kind of tie these together. And I think one thing that we always counsel clients is you eat an elephant one bite at a time, right? We don't need to go to the greatest level of XLAs and VLAs that we've ever seen on day one. And I think you need a partner that's willing to grow with you in that. And I think that's where I'm seeing some service providers differentiate themselves, where they take a step back from their old school dusty playbook of here's the KPIs that I want to give my clients that make it easiest for me to deliver this deal, to looking at a different model where ownership's a little bit more appropriately placed. And then you can use that to kind of build a platform and build some momentum across the organization that really helps to kind of show the value of these AI and agentic contracts that you're putting in place.
Yeah, no, Justin, I think the key takeaway that I'm at least taking away from what you just described, this is a partnership, right? This is not an outsourcing contract where the service provider is the owner of all these SLAs and you've sort of shoved it over the fence and it's your job, but it's co-owned, and sometimes the business or the client has to own some of this, right? And I think the contracts that we are seeing or that you are advising on seem to be more partnership driven. It seems more like a joint venture versus an outsourcing contract, and I think that's the mindset that we have to move in. And by the way, we've got like 31 questions and 10 minutes, so we'll have to run through this. But the one big topic, and Mike, I would love to get your perspectives on this, is sovereignty, right? And I think it's at one level it's a political and a government issue, but we are seeing it percolate down into contracts as well. How should we think of AI sovereignty? Because, or first, please define what AI sovereignty is also.
Sovereignty does seem to be one of these terms which has come to the fore and probably means as much as things like digital or AI. A few people actually get down to defining it. as HFS, we've issued now 2 papers on this, and one as recently as 3 weeks ago. And we looked at the definition. And today, if you go into the market, you will find many sovereign compliant solutions available, but the definition has not been applied. And if we think about sovereignty, probably worth thinking about the geopolitical situation as well, and why this is coming to the fore, particularly in Europe at the moment. Where sovereign compliant products sit today is in jurisdictional sovereignty, i.e. whose law applies to my contract, and where is my data, where are my model weights, where are my inference workloads, and if I've got control of them within my boundaries, I'm safe. Now, of course, if you were in Bahrain when the drones hit AWS's data centers, because for the reasons of both sovereignty and a legal requirement to keep personal data within the country, that wiped out a huge amount of business in Bahrain, and that is still being put back in place. So jurisdictional sovereignty is great, but actually doesn't defend you against that sort of strike. But it doesn't have to be a drone. So when the US Senate asked Microsoft to hand over the email addresses, names, agenda items, and meeting notes for the government department in Holland, which was implementing the European Data Act, they did so despite the fact that that was being held in a data center in the Netherlands. And that's because of the Cloud Act. So this is obviously giving cause for a lot of concern at governmental level. And then the other definition we came forward was with operational sovereignty. So if somebody wants to try and close down your business, you've got to make sure that your controls are in place, your resilience plans are in place, so that they can't. So the kind of geopolitical shock that could give rise to the absence of your models, we saw that with Anthropic withdrawing Fable and Mythos, is an example of that. And then the last point we looked at, which was the strategic stack sovereignty. Although the conversation and even this slide talks about sovereign AI, you've got to consider that your resilience across the whole stack, from all the way from energy and power, all the way up to applications and your human in the loop, where are your resources? And in the paper, and I'm going to keep this brief, we identified 5 or 6, and actually 5 stress tests that vendors and enterprises could use to test their resilience against geopolitical shock. Now, where it becomes flow down to everyone on this call is obviously the governments will define certain areas within government that are truly sovereign. So Ministry of Defence or Defence, Energy, Utilities, even railways. Then if the government's going to set down sovereign restrictions and requirements, that's going to feed down through the contracts that you see from those organizations into many of the SIs and service providers that we will have on this call. And that's becoming quite an issue here in Europe. It won't be answered this year, but you will start to see negotiation of contracts in this space. And our recommendation to our clients has been, get into that negotiation, working with governments and sovereign enterprises to ensure that you could influence the contract terms. So I think that's going to be key, and applying the stress tests that we talked about. And one of the questions, I was on a panel recently with NVIDIA and others that came up was mostly GSIs are leading alliances which are driving sovereign solutions, certainly at stack level. And there was a demand from a very high level audience that the GSIs look to underwrite the resilience of their sovereign AI recommendations. So that's something to think about, I think.
Yeah, no, this is great, and I think this could be a webinar all by itself, Mike. But I think the point is sovereignty is not something that you should leave for governments to think of. You have to think of it in your own services, technology, data conversations, and it's right here, right now, not some future state. Um, before before we take some of the audience questions, Justin, related to the point that Mike was making, how should the TNCs start to change? And keep it brief if possible, because we're out of time. Uh, what are you seeing as some new TNCs coming in, and what are some of the old TNCs that should be retired, frankly?
Yeah, and thanks, Saurabh, and I'll do my best to keep it, to a minute or two. So I'll just hit the highlights. I think we've talked about some, right? The human labor SLAs need to go. FTE rate cards are increasingly also being removed from contracts because we're not basing it on FTE effort. It's based on agentic and AI effort. Where I think you kind of need to, and at least where I'm seeing clients are trying to look and kind of rebalance risk is how do you add more or newer terms to the contract in order to help guide through the learnings of AI. And so when you think about disclosure and approval rights and how AI makes decisions, the IP ownership is always a hot topic. We own outputs plus a perpetual license from a client perspective, while the service provider keeps the underlying IP has been a successful recommendation and journey that we've taken some clients through. And I think really it's about more transparency. You need to be able to understand how decisions were made and and assigning an owner to those decisions ahead of time is probably the biggest advice that I can have people walk away with. Don't wait until after your AI or agent model is in place before you figure out who owns that decision, because it's never easy to kind of unpack that or get that toothpaste back in the tube, as my mother used to say. You've got to make that decision up front and really understand who owns the outcome. And if they don't like it, then they need to understand how to fix it. And that's kind of where some of the other terms and conditions come into play.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic, Justin. And look, we've got, as I mentioned, we've got like tons of questions here, as you can imagine. I'm going to take my favorite question here, which is, and maybe Joe, if you can take a first crack at this, because I think you were going through something very similar with a client right now. And the question is, I'm trying to negotiate a contract with a vendor who's already proposing a services as a software framework, but doesn't pass the gain to me, the client. For instance, we feel the services as software contract will help the vendor cut 95% of the FTEs and workforce, but they're only committing to the 5 to 8% continuous improvement to the client. How do you include this into the contract? So basically, the client feels like all this AI stuff is giving a lot of cost reduction to the provider, and they're making, I think Ian also made the point, they're improving their margin significantly, but none of that or very little of that is being passed to the client.
So there's almost no way that I'll get this responded to within the time we have left. But that said, sometimes you have to market test. If your provider isn't able to deliver what you think you ought to be getting, then it doesn't hurt to go talk to a couple of other folks. You don't have to belabor the point. It doesn't have to be adversarial, but it is important. Market discovery is part of the procurement process. That said, have you sat down with your current provider and just said face to face, I think this should cost me 95% less. And if you can't do it, then I don't have a choice. I can't go get this re-upped with my board. I'm going to have to go talk to other people. And if they can come back with the right solution on the other side of that meets all of your other requirements, then maybe that's not necessary. But I mean, there aren't, and maybe I'm wrong. I mean, Justin, Ian, others, Mike, if you have other experience that you think would make sense, I think at some point you just have to, call a spade a spade.
Totally agree, Joe.
Yeah, I think I would say reach out to HFS.
That's a much better
We
response.
we can
Thought that was
help.
implied.
But look, I think we're out of time. We've got a whole lot of questions, and I think the five of us will take these questions and try and respond individually, and we'll probably publish some sort of a FAQ on the questions received, because there's just a lot of interesting questions we can't justify in the time that we have. But I think in summary, I would say we can't subscribe to Netflix and keep counting DVDs. It's just not gonna work. And I think at some point of time, we have, whether you're a buyer or a seller, you have to realize that this sourcing process is broken. And I think it's time to move from the sourcing theater that we've been doing for the last 30 years, um, to actual problem solving. This should be about, nobody has the perfect answer. This cannot be a templatized process that you buy off the shelf and, you know, just fill in your name and address and pass on the contract. This is a problem solving approach. Nobody has the perfect answers to this. The best thing is to get both sides on the table, and get people together and talk through this, and that is why we launched this AID labs, and we very consciously coined it as labs, because these were problem solving sessions. This is not a process driven approach where I'm seeing RFPs being written by AI and RFPs being responded by AI. So what's the point? I think we need to get humans back in the loop and start to talk to each other, and we can solve for this. But with that, thank you, Joe, Mike, Justin, Ian. As always, fantastic inputs. And we'll be in touch. We'll get back to the questions, and hopefully this was an interesting conversation. So thanks everyone. Thanks for your time, and have a fun rest of your week.
Thanks all.
Thanks, Saurabh.